And it's 8:33, cloudy sky, 44 degrees. It is a quick slam this morning at the Capitol Wednesday. We send it back to the State House. Mike Lear anchors our coverage. Mike?
Let me get my thoughts together here. And joining us now in the studio is Missouri's Attorney General Chris Koster. Thanks for being with us once again. Good to see you.
It's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Glad to have you back on. And a couple of topics that have come up even in the last week. I want to start with domestic abuse. And this is something that you put together a task force on. And the list of recommendations that that task force arrived at released in just the last week. Tell us, first of all, how you came to the idea that this needed to be done.
Well, there is an individual who has worked on a long-term basis here at the Capitol by the name of Colleen Coble. And do you know Colleen?
I know the name. I've not met her.
Okay, so Colleen has worked in this building really almost single-handedly on this issue since, I bet, the early 1990s, maybe the late 1980s. But very passionate, very well-liked on both sides of the political aisle. And this has been her life's work. And I got to know Colleen when I was an intern here 25 years ago, 23 years ago, something like that. And when I came back to the Senate, we renewed our acquaintanceship, and she was still passionate about these issues. And then the Attorney General's race began in 2008. And both Senator Gibbons and myself, who were the competitors for the AG spot in 2008, promised Colleen, because both of us have great respect for her, promised Colleen that whoever won, that we would take a renewed look after 30 years at the domestic violence statutes of this state. And largely it is out of, I'd like to say part of it is out of a desire to go do something very positive in a given area of law. But part of it is a recognition of one person's life's work and the impact that one individual can have in this giant building. Colleen gets the credit.
And what a tremendous resource then it must have been to you to begin that process, to have someone who had spent that much time on the issue over all those years.
Right. There is nobody who knows more about these issues than Colleen does. And so what had happened was about 30 years ago, then Attorney General John Ashcroft had done a pretty thorough review, this type of a full symposium analysis of the domestic violence laws of the state. And we really just redid that. We went back 30 years later. We held hearings in St. Louis, in Columbia, and Kansas City. We talked to people from the law enforcement community, the courts community, the social services network, the gay community. I mean, because domestic violence is not just a problem in the straight community. It also affects people in the gay community. We brought everybody together. And we looked for what were 10 or 12 incremental things that we could do to make the law better, and that's what we synthesized, and that's what's in the report.
Let's pick the report apart. Let's start with the things that will essentially just go in order here, or maybe you'd like to, if not in order, pick what you think was the one issue of all these. What do you think was the most important?
Well, a couple of things are important. The number one recommendation is a pretty simple one. It's just definitional in nature. Actually, sometimes, over the course of a generation, different definitions are used to describe the same thing. So the term domestic violence or the term adult with regard to domestic violence applies in different sections of the statute to different age groups of people. And so a court doesn't know whether to begin its enforcement over an individual at the age of 17 in one section or the age of 18 in another section. So recommendation number one is to go through and just standardize all of the definitions related to this entire area. The second thing, and I come out of the prosecution world. I spent 10 years as a prosecutor over on the western border before we came to Jefferson City. The second thing that means a lot to me has to do with best practices, best law enforcement practices. And here's the situation. Domestic violence occurs in an apartment or a home, and it's 10:30 at night or 11 o'clock at night, and two police officers show up and they take, let's say the husband is the abuser, and they take the husband out of the house. Now, the next, and a report is written. The next question is, does a detective for that local sheriff's department show up and talk to that woman who was the victim that evening? Does a detective show up the next day, 2 days later, or does it take a detective 10 days to come and talk with her? the amount of time that it takes a detective to get back to that house and talk to the woman and begin to bring her into the law enforcement process makes an enormous difference in her willingness to participate in the prosecution going forward. Because if right from the get-go she gets the sense that the law enforcement agencies and the law enforcement system are too busy to deal with her and that her problems are not very serious, she's going to drop out of the process, and she's not going to show up for hearings, and she's not going to testify against her abuser, and the whole thing is going to fall on its face. So that is showing that kind of immediate, timely caring. It's an obvious idea, but it's a huge winner for law enforcement.
What is the most important time to go back and talk to her? Because I would think, well, obviously 10 days is too long. Do you want to get to her right away? Do you want to give her some time to kind of calm back down again? If
a law enforcement agency has the resources, I would think that within 48 hours you want to be back. Certainly you want the situation to calm down, but I think that you want to be back there by the second day. And to let her know that there are social services resources for her, there are shelters that she can reach out to, there are prosecutors who are experienced in this area and are going to take this case seriously, and all these resources are there, and therefore what we are asking of her is to have courage, because going through the court system is it's just challenging. It's a difficult, day by day, frustratingly slow, sometimes challenge to go through. And we need her to have courage, and in order for her to have courage, we got to show her that we're prepared to help her.
Orders of protection, obviously one of the biggest things that a person who is a victim of domestic violence can do to try and protect themselves from further incidents while they're going through that process. What needed to be addressed there?
A couple things on the order of protection. Really, to summarize it, because we're getting into questions now that are fairly intricate in the law and may not be that digestible on radio. But the orders of protection, we wanted to give the courts more flexibility. I mean, if I was to offer a summary statement that it incorporated the 4 or 5 different changes to the order of protection statute, it is to untie the hands of the judges so that the judges can analyze a situation independently and do what's right. And they are not tied by some kind of bureaucratic time standards, that they have more ability to craft a bond document to say to the abuser, to the defendant, okay, you're going to act a certain way in the next 90 days. You're going to show up at these hearings in the next 90 days. We're trying to empower the judges to be able to do the right thing and to get these abusers back in line as quickly as possible.
What are your thoughts on the way that orders of protection are enforced in terms of penalties for violating them? Was that adequate, or did that need to be looked at as well?
It differs by judge. There are different communities where we think that the orders of protection are really working well. Frankly, Kansas City, we found, I think, is really doing this entire area of law enforcement exceptionally well. There's a judge in the Columbia area by the name of Debbie Daniels, who used to be a very high-ranking member of the Attorney General's office under Attorney General Nixon. Now she's a judge in Boone County up in the Columbia area. And she really has put together an exceptional stratagem for dealing with these types of issues. And so part of the effort of the whole report was to figure out who are the star players around the state of Missouri, and try and lift up these lessons so that they can be incorporated more broadly.
All right. I also want to ask you about, and you make what I think is a great correlation here, a great comparison to look at domestic violence abuses, repeat offenses, in the same way that driving while intoxicated laws were looked at just a few years ago in terms of, again, repeat offenses. There were some, I think that's an interesting comparison.
Right. As society has grown more intolerant of drinking while driving, we have upped the penalties. We've taken, alcohol, the intake in the body down to 0.08. We have said that repeat offenders can no longer be continually tried in municipal court, that they have to be brought up to state court. And we thought that this problem was serious enough and compares well enough that a defendant, an abuser, should not be able to hide in the municipal courts of a small town in Missouri or in the municipal courts of a big city so that, he hits his wife time and time again, and he's in front of a municipal judge who has limited authority, limited powers, no authority to send him to prison. And it's time that, as soon as someone becomes a repeat offender in hitting a loved one and hitting a spouse and hitting a wife, that they need to be dragged out of that municipal court and taken up to state court, where you've got judges who have real power and real hammers in their hand to deal with these guys. The problem of domestic violence is so much broader than people really realize. 50, 60,000 instances a year on these types of situations. And, one of the other interesting statistics is that for every woman who leaves a house, and think about the courage it takes to pack your bags, grab your kids, leave a house at 1 a.m, and go out to a local shelter. For every one woman who does that and gets into that shelter, there are 2 women who get turned away from that shelter because the shelter is full. So that gives you a sense of the depth of the problem across the state. We're in a time of limited resources, but this is a big deal, and there are a lot of women who are asking for help that the state is turning away because we just don't have the resources right now to provide assistance.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation the gay community. We know that often domestic violence, obviously, is generally thought of as being the man hitting the woman. We know it happens both ways. In going through what's in the books, did you find any discrepancies in the way it's dealt with, depending on who the victim and who the offender are, either in the law or in the application of it? I asked that question a lot. I wanted to know the answer, and it's a really good question. I'm fairly impressed that you asked it. What we heard from members of the gay community who came and testified was that the courts are treating them pretty well, and there was not a sense that we heard, or at least in the testimony, and we've got the transcript. People can go and read the transcript. It's up on our website, word for word. We did not get a sense that there was prejudice that was occurring in the domestic violence arena vis-a-vis the gay community. The gay community has very few protections under Missouri law. But one protection that they do have is that they are incorporated under our domestic violence statute, and that was done back in the late 1980s, I think. And so I wanted to know, how were the judges dealing with these issues across the state? And the responses that we received actually were more hopeful and helpful even than I expected. I want to come back to the list of recommendations in a moment.